Can everybody hear me? On behalf of the Israel Action Committee, I welcome you to tonight's program with Dr. Jonatan Shimshoni. Oh, so you can't hear me. Okay. Okay. How's this? Okay. He served in the IDF for 25 years. At the culmination of his career, he had the rank of Tataluf, which is Brigadier General, and he was Director of Planning. And he received his PhD from Princeton with a specialty in security policy. He has taught at Princeton and pursued research on strategic issues at MIT and the Woodrow Wilson Center. He has published widely and has contributed columns to Haaretz. And he served on several committees of the Israel National Security Council. And as part of the IDF reserves, he worked extensively on very challenging security issues related to economics, technology, strategy, and doctrine. And in recent years, his work has focused on society-centric warfare and the implications for strategy. He was also managing partner at PwC Consulting in Israel and has led the establishment and management of a startup company. And we're just very excited to have him here and appreciate his taking the time.
Well, first of all, thanks to so many people for coming in. Although it's not a happy occasion, even though it is the 76th birthday. But I've seen happier birthdays in my life. And we'll talk about that. And I know the CV, when I sat there and I heard my own bio, it sounded really good. So just to put it in context, excuse me, the startup company that I started just shut down because it didn't succeed. So just excuse me? Okay. I guess this because of the way we're set up, this will not be a conversation. It will not be a dialogue. It will be I guess, a monologue and then questions. You know the definition of an Israeli monologue? It's good that we're in the States, because in Israel, a monologue is one person talking to himself. And a dialogue is two people, each speaking to himself. So hopefully that's not where we'll be. I also apologize for starting to lose my voice. I've had a number of interactions over the last 48 hours, and you'll pay the price, actually. I won't pay the price. Just a word on, because I don't think it was mentioned, I'm here on behalf, well, of myself, but also of an organization, an Israeli organization called Commanders for Israel Security. And we are a group of about, I think by now, close to 600 former senior IDF officers, Mossad, and there are parallels in the Mossad, Shin Bet, police, prison service, and diplomatic corps. And what we do is we try to, we take a nonpartisan, security-focused view on policy issues. And then we try to advocate for what we come up with as recommended directions of action. We used to be in close, very intimate contact with the government and other institutions. And as you'll discover, our direction of thinking, when I reveal mine, since this government has been in power, we have been talking to the public and not to the government in terms of our efforts to advocate, mainly because this government is not really interested in our perspective. I mean, they know our perspective and therefore are not interested. So it's the 76th birthday, and it's a good time for a reckoning every time a birthday comes along. And this one in particular, because things are really happening. So just a, sort of a high-level picture or characterization of where we are. Israel, as you know, is stuck in a long war, what the Americans call a long war. Doesn't look like we can achieve the goals of the war. And very little by way of achievement so far, but it doesn't look like we can get to meaningful achievements. And Hamas is not only still there, but seems to be calling the shots to a great extent. We have entire regions of Israel are depopulated. I don't know if anybody's been there recently. The Gaza envelope, you know, and the entire northern border is not only depopulated, but it is actually, we've sort of given up our sovereignty there. If you look at it from a certain perspective, actually that whole part of the country is controlled by Hezbollah. It's not controlled by Israel. So we've sort of surrendered our sovereignty to that part of the country, and it's not clear how we're going to regain it. We have ideas, but it's not clear that we can actually regain it. Iran its ability to create mischief in the region, and especially vis-a-vis Israel, has not been hurt. Its ability has not been degraded. And more important than that, although it relates to this, Israel finds itself in a situation that is not new, but now the realization has sunk in, that it's in a region where it confronts many fronts. In other words, it has many challenges, security challenges. Gaza is only like one piece of the puzzle. The security challenge puzzle is actually quite broad and broader than we had thought, in the sense that we always knew it was there, but it was kind of, you could take them on one at a time. They weren't so big and they weren't so active. But now it's clear that we have Gaza, but we have the West Bank, we have Lebanon, Iran, Houthis, we have significant Iranian activity in Syria, and we have Iranian activity that's trying to penetrate Jordan as well. So it's many fronts, and they are interrelated or integrate. They're not integrated, but they are interrelated. So we find ourselves, we are the same, but when we look at the security environment, it's something we have to understand about it. It's different than what it was, or what we thought it was, and therefore requires different kinds of responses. You can't respond the same way to something that's different and expect to succeed. Internally, aside from the trauma and the various processes that Israeli society has gone through because of the war, because of October 7th and the ensuing war, we find ourselves actually, after a spike of serious solidarity and internal mobilization, we find ourselves much more polarized than we were even in recent past. So Israeli internal polarization really rose to the surface with, I think in this country you call it judicial reform, which was anything but a reform, but that's what we're calling it. I call it a constitutional revolution. But when that emerged as the agenda of this coalition, the internal polarization sort of got much worse. And people had a feeling, as we did, or as I did, that the war would somehow take this someplace else. It actually hasn't. The internal polarization continues, and this coalition, or is part of a very important part of the leadership mechanism and style of the current leadership is to actually use and exploit the polarization for its political purposes. So it makes polarization more extreme and not less. On the external fronts, it's pretty clear that Israel's relations with the United States have had better days. And its relationship with American politics have been better, with the Democratic Party have been much better, with American Jewish community have been better. Since this is very significant, not because I'm in the US now talking to an American Jewish community, but if you think, if you're just doing a security analysis, a strategic analysis in Israel or for Israel, and you ask, what are the most important assets for Israeli security? Well, there's a list, but when you get to the paragraph on who are Israel's most important allies, from a security perspective, not a value perspective or a good feeling perspective, who are the most important security-oriented allies of Israel? And they are the United States. I would say even more, it's bipartisan United States, and it is the American Jewish community. Those are the two most important strategic allies for Israel. And got a problem there. Now, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but if Israel is the national home of the Jewish people, then this war, I don't want to say caused, created, and I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not an American, so I don't know enough about it. But attending this war, and clearly related to it, is a spike in anti-Semitism in the United States. So, and not just in the United States. So, if you think that's your role in the world, to be the national home of the Jewish people, then that is actually part of the war for you, for Israel. And obviously that's not good. And still in America, we see as part of this war, or a result of the war, the very first successes ever of the BDS movement. Right? This is the first time. So we see American universities agreeing to reconsider their investments in Israel. Formally, agreement, in writing. They have agreed to do it. We see, so we follow this in Israel. We see Israeli scholars being denied co-authorship with European and American researchers on articles because the editors tell them they will not publish them, the articles, so wait till next year because right now it's too sensitive. Invitations to come for sabbaticals, they're being told, now this is not wholesale yet, this is retail, small numbers, but you see it happening. So people are being told, let's wait a semester, let's wait a year. Okay. So all of this picture together, I don't want to be dramatic, but I want to be precise, do all together form an existential state threat to the state of Israel. Okay. This is existential. And people sometimes tell me, the U.S. has real problems, real issues. Some of them very big, and we make these big mistakes. We go to Afghanistan, we go to Vietnam, we go to Iraq, and after the fact discover that we spent trillions and killed thousands, and whatever bad stuff happened. And my feeling about that is the U.S. is in a unique, maybe a globally unique situation where it can make tremendous mistakes and fall on its nose and get up and dust itself off and keep going. Because you have the privilege of being very big, very rich. You have an ocean on one side and one on the other. You have Canada to your north. You have Mexico to your south. You can come home and regroup, and we can't come home and regroup. There's nowhere to go. You look back, there's nothing there. So you get worked into an impossible situation. It may just be impossible. So something to keep in mind. So clearly, Israeli national security strategy needs a rethink under these circumstances. And our group that's sort of what we do. So we got together recently and set up a team to think about what would be the principles of an alternative national security strategy, something that we could push out into the public and have a debate, discussion, or whatever. And it takes about 5 minutes to realize that it's almost impossible to do at the moment. And the reason it's almost impossible to do, or the main reason is, you can't get off the block and start running, because the very basic elements of ethos of Israel are not defined. And they are in deep argument and debate, and they are part of the polarization that I mentioned earlier. So how do you do a national security strategy for a country that hasn't decided if its expansionist or status quo, if its borders are here or if its borders are somewhere else? Does it want to live in the region, or does it want to integrate in the region? Two totally, completely different ways of thinking about what the state is, and would generate a different approach to security. If you just want to live in the region, then you're okay with being at odds with your neighbors. And I'm not saying whether that's good or not. Then you'll have a certain way of thinking about how you build up your national security. If you think of yourself as integrating into the region, you'll have a different expectation of your relations with your neighbors, and you will work to create a different set of relations, and then your national security approach will again be different. Something that I mentioned at the beginning, are you a Jewish state for the people who live within the state? That's one possibility. Or are you the national home of the Jewish people? So as one journalist, American journalist, told me the other day, and this relates to something I mentioned earlier, he said, well, if you're the national home of the Jewish people, then when you think about what you do from a security perspective, you must take into account its impact on the Jewish community worldwide. Because you're not a state like any other state, and if that's what you think you are, that's your basic ethos. You're a different kind of a state, and you have a responsibility to Jewish communities in Newton and in Paris and in South America, and you have a responsibility. So they become part of the calculus of what you do and your pursuit of national security requirements in Israel. So that has to be worked out. One of the problems we've had, of course, it's not a new issue. So you go back into the historical documents and you look for the, I don't know if incumbent is the right word, the current national security strategy. Like America every 4 years does an update of its national security approach, does a national security review, and so on and so forth. So you go back and look for, so before we start something new, let's see what exists. And what you discover is that there's a lot of Torah Sheba'al Peh, okay? There's nothing written down since Ben Gurion. Because especially since 67, no one's been able to define the state. So there's stuff that Ben Gurion wrote, and he was actually, in substance, alluding back to stuff that Jabotinsky wrote, but that's the last written sort of documentation of a national security strategy. After that, it became, as I said, Torah Sheba'al Peh, people, leaders, did this, did that, changed a bit, and so on and so forth. And the reason is there was little to stand on. And as a result, if you look at the little that was written or has been written, it was sort of all brought down to how do you think about, sort of at a very high level, organizing and building up your forces. So we had 3 magic words, and then there was a 4th that was added over time. But it was all only force-oriented and at a level of words, which was then, it was translated. So it was early warning and definitive victory, deterrence, and to those, after some time, there was, at one point in the history, which was about 10 years ago, defense was added. So the state should be able to deter, and if deterrence failed, to have early warning, and if early warning failed, it would be able to respond and then transfer the war to the enemy's territory and win. And that was basically it for many years, and then about a decade ago, and defend itself as well. Okay. By the way, Iron Dome came out of the word defense in this puzzle. The external threat that we've seen converged with many of the issues that I just raised now that have to do with the basic ethos of the country. And maybe, at first we thought, well, we had this internal issue going on, and then on October 7th, the problem changed, and we started to deal with an external problem. So we had the judicial reform, and then we had a war with Hamas and Gaza and so on and so forth. And these are not separate issues. And they feed off each other and bounce off each other. I'll give you the most sort of pedestrian example. It's clear that one of the main motivators of the judicial reform or revolution that was in play was, two of the motivators. One of them was to legalize, in a definitive way, the excuse for military service for the Orthodox. Okay. And that was going to be made possible by legislative changes and so on and so forth. And the other was to remove the shackles from policies and the ability to oversee policies that were leading to a gradual annexation of the West Bank. And the way to enable those two things to move forward, we would have this sort of constitutional or judicial revolution or reform or whatever that would make it legal on one of them and impossible to control the other. Okay. So both of those issues have now come home to roost as a result of the war. They were always there, and the issues were serious for many, many, many years, but now they're in your face. You can no longer say it's not an issue because it's sitting there and it's actually not just in your face, it's making it impossible for you to move forward. So, say the most, maybe the clearest, has to do with conscription of the Orthodox community. So as a result, before the war, everybody said this is wrong. Not everybody, obviously, but a large part of the population said this is wrong, it can't go on, it's impossible. We have part of the country carrying all the load, another part of society not carrying the load. It's wrong in all manner of senses. But so we'll deal with it over time, and that's what Israel was doing, sort of dealing with it over time. Every government kicked the can down the road, basically. It was never really dealt with. And people said, it's wrong. But that's about it. And people were going to the courts, and maybe it would have received some treatment. And what happened as a result of the war is the development of an agreement that makes a lot of sense, that the size of the army has to grow. We need a bigger army. And we need more reservists under arms at any given moment. So, especially if you are this coalition that depends on the Haredim, on the Orthodox for its survival, what do? You legislate a new national security law, which enables the extension of service from 32 months to 36, and doubles the number of days per year that a reservist can do. Okay, so you try to pass that legislation, and you find yourself facing basically a revolution or a revolt. The reservists are saying, 60 days a year, we could sort of somehow put up with that. We have businesses, families, you want us to go for twice that? And we have this whole sector of the population that's doing zero? Game over, we're not doing that. And the mothers of the conscripts saying, no. You want to extend the length of conscripted service, and now, so we have now wars, and now it comes home because our kids get hurt, they die, and there's a whole sector of the population that doesn't take part in any of this. So this new legislation is going nowhere, and probably won't, and so we will have a major crisis around it. But it's an example of where the external crisis met the internal one in a bad way. A few particular but high-level lessons from the war itself. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the war and dealt with it, but there's some critical insights that come out of the war that I think are worth thinking about. Israel intended, in response to October 7th, Israel intended to wage a very major conventional war in which it would destroy the Hamas army, quote unquote, and the Hamas infrastructure and weaponry, et cetera, and get the hostages back. But that's, okay. And Hamas, so that was the intent, to wage this kind of war. It was a departure from decisions that had been made for many, many years, a decision that was, we do not wage major war in Gaza because we believe that a major war in Gaza will end up being really messy, really problematic, very long, hard to win, get us in trouble with ourselves and with the world, etc. And I was actually part of that decision-making process. And so, the basic decision was we may exchange blows with Gaza, maybe some major blows, but we're not going to go there on a major invasion and try to wage a conventional war, because it won't end up that way. Hamas' strategy, and we know this from what they've said, aside from observing their behavior, they understood this. But they needed us to wage a major war in Gaza. They needed Israel to go in and do everything that Israel has been doing in Gaza. They knew that Israel did not want to. So their trap was to do October 7th. Okay? The nature of October 7th, the nature of that attack on October 7th was such that it got Israel to act despite all of its analytical decisions that had been made for many, many, many years. So it was a situation in which I don't think we should have helped ourselves. I mean, I think we should have done certain things differently, and I'll tell you in a moment. But yes, we should have done. We should have gone with a major invasion. But it's important to understand that the way they got us to go in, and then the way they set up their forces in Gaza, and their tunneling system, and their dispersal among the civilian population, and so on, they were fighting a different war. We were trying to fight a conventional campaign. They weren't doing that at all. They were fighting a societal war. For them, the way to win was to manipulate all of the societies involved in this war. Palestinian, Saudi, American campuses, French, German, English, Emirati, and so on. So they were fighting a different war. That part we did not get. So, and in fact, for them, the most important tool in this war was and has been, what is the most important tool, if that's your strategy? The most important tool for them was the IDF. They had to get the IDF to do what the IDF did. That was the keystone of their strategy. We're going to get the IDF to come in and do all of this. We're not going to beat the IDF. We're going to get all of the societies involved in this war, that are involved, that are stakeholders in this war, to start forcing decisions and processes, each in their own, that will serve our meaning Hamas, our purposes. That's their war. We're going to manipulate even American society so that the re-election of the president is questioned. Okay? And this is not, I don't have an opinion on that one way or the other, but the point is that is the nature of their strategy and the war that they were fighting and that we fell into. If you know you're going into that kind of war, and you understand that that's the strategy of the enemy, that's not a reason not to go to war. But it's a reason to act in a way that takes that into account. So for example, our organization, like from I'm not exaggerating, week 3 into the war. So let's say week 5 or 6, after October 7th, we begged the Israeli government to flood Gaza with humanitarian assistance. So this is not from many of us individually from a moral perspective or whatever, but I'm just from a strategic perspective. This is going to start, if you don't mitigate the damage to Gazan people, you are going to enable them to manipulate the dynamics in the various societies that are looking in or care about or whatever about this war. So flood Gaza with, immediately, humanitarian assistance, set up field hospitals, do whatever it takes so that the reality and people's understanding is that we are not out to get the Gazan people, and that we differentiate between Hamas and them to the extent that it's possible. The other is to understand that force, as I said at the beginning, our basic paradigm of security has been force. Israel. And it's pretty natural, and I wouldn't criticize that particularly. But that's been the major lens through which we've looked at security issues. Not always, sometimes ad hoc. We have looked at other dimensions of security. For example, the peace with Egypt is a major, major achievement of national security for Israel that was achieved by giving the Sinai back. So you didn't use force. Actually, you went the other way. We do know from so many historical examples that you cannot, there's a famous professor in Chicago who wrote a really good book called Bombing to Win. It's very, very difficult to bomb your way, bombing meaning taking on the civilian population. It's very, very difficult to create through targeting civilians, targeting in many different ways, to get some kind of indirect pressure on leadership to change policy with regard to the war, especially a leadership that could care less about its civilians. Okay. But even a leadership that does is very, very difficult. So America tried to bomb its way to victory with the Brits in Germany in World War II. And it didn't work, even though it killed hundreds of thousands of Germans. What worked in the end was, conquest and occupation, and destruction of the German army. But an attempt was made to bomb to victory. In Japan, had a similar experience, and the only reason that worked is that you managed to bring them to a state of fatigue and exhaustion and starvation, et cetera, that finally sort of the country and its society and leadership all rolled over. I don't think that's something we can do now. We definitely can't throw atomic bombs at a civilian population. So bombing to win, in these kinds of wars especially, is not something you want to do. There's a word that in 1938 became a four-letter word. And until 1938, was an acceptable instrument of national security. Anybody know which word went out of fashion in 1938? Think Chamberlain? Appeasement, right. Till 1938, appeasement was a legitimate, kosher instrument of national security and diplomatic policy. And if you read, I went back to read the discussions in the British government in the decade leading to World War II. And appeasement was a legitimate idea, and it was called that and put on the table, and then it was argued. Should we appease? Should we not appease? Is this the right situation in which appeasement could work? Is it the wrong situation? Obviously, Chamberlain thought it was the right situation. Churchill thought it was absolutely the wrong situation. Churchill was right. And from that moment on, nobody can say appeasement anymore. If you say the word appeasement, somebody says, oh, Munich, and sort of the discussion is ended. But actually, I mentioned giving up the Sinai. Giving up the Sinai was an act of appeasement. You said the Egyptians, well, we now understand, although we had to learn it the hard way. You know, we had to go through the Yom Kippur War. We now understand that these guys, this is a national interest that has to do with the internal identity and ethos of the Egyptian state. And if we don't return all of the territory that belonged to Egypt, in their view, there cannot be a stable equilibrium, ever. This thing will boil forever. And the fact that we own the Sinai and sit way out there isn't really going to do us much good for very long, and it's going to be incredibly expensive to maintain if we want to maintain that kind of status quo. And as a friend of mine just said recently, these Cold Wars, or even these low-level frictions, they just don't last forever. At some point, and when you're least expecting it, the other side is going to do something. So one of our recommendations is to reintroduce appeasement as a legitimate instrument. And we're not saying appease at every case, or in every situation, but we do believe that while you might be able, with incredible force and a lid that gets hot, heavier and heavier, keep the Palestinian issue pacific, quiet, somehow, you can't forever, because there are national aspirations that have to do with the internal identity that you're just not going to be able to quash forever. And you'll get it and the more you quash it, by the way, the more extreme they may become, and you'll get, we ended up with a Hamas-type explosion, and it could be something else in the future. It's like a Hegelian set of contradictions, and at the end it comes to roost. So think in that direction. Final word, you remember the night of April 13? Iran fired 380 objects at Israel. And 1% got through. And that was a pretty phenomenal evening. Because only 1% got through, it ended up, to the observers like us, not being very dramatic. It was kind of like a video game. Okay. But of course, it wasn't a video game. And there's a very important lesson in that night. Because first of all, we see that Iran is willing to take on Israel seriously. It was the first time they were willing to actually take us on in a direct confrontation. Second, the way in which the interception took place was by the mobilization and activation of a regional coalition. So Israel didn't do this alone. With US leadership and participation of Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and I think the Egyptians were on the margin there, but so we have Saudi Arabia and Jordan and France and Britain, and of course Israel as the main player. But you got a glimpse of two things. One is just how dangerous the neighborhood can be, and you understand that you alone could not have dealt with the challenge. That particular challenge, so you would have survived, and it was a one-off, but the night would not have ended up looking the way it did. It would have been a very different night. And what sunk in, and you see this more and more, not decision makers, because I don't know what they're thinking, but more and more strategists understand is that A, Israel is overextended in its abilities relative to its challenges. And that for the first time in its history, it needs to think about a regional architecture for defense and of itself as part of the regional architecture and not as, I'm Popeye, just get me the spinach, but I can do this. That's, at least in my opinion, in our opinion, and in other strategists' opinion, that's no longer the case. But there is a regional coalition that is willing to come together into which Israel can integrate. And it's painful. I mean, that whole idea is painful because it touches on your self-image. You know, we are really strong, powerful state, and if you supply us with the capabilities and the hardware and the ordnance, et cetera, we can defend ourselves better than anybody else. We don't need your troops. We don't need your participation. We don't need anything. Waking up to a different realization is very, very painful. But I think it's better to look at reality the way it is. And also at the good side, which is there are states who are willing to participate in this kind of coalition. And they've told us, you know, we ask ourselves, if we now reduce the aperture to Gaza, back to Gaza, say, so who's going to govern Gaza? What's it going to be? And there aren't too many options. It's either Israel stays in for a very lengthy occupation, or somebody else takes it, or nobody takes it. So if nobody takes it, Hamas will somehow rebound, or it will become a Somalia-type gang-led thing, or somebody else will come in. A whole number of Arab states have told us, have told the Americans, that they are willing to participate in governing Gaza in sort of a multinational architecture, as long as the Israelis, of course there are conditions. So the Israelis stay out, and the Palestinian Authority is part of the governance structure. And those are kind of the easy conditions. And there's a third condition, which is, and Israel commits to an eventual Palestinian state. Okay. So the third condition, of course, hits Israeli polarization, and you get the whole thing. But those are the conditions. But there is an opportunity. There was somewhere in the title about opportunity. There is an opportunity to restructure our security environment in a big way, and not necessarily that we like it, but put the Palestinian issue, you know, within that, in a place where it should probably be, and probably in a dynamic or in a process that does lead eventually to a Palestinian state, not overnight, and under all kinds of conditions. I think that would put Israel in a completely different place, as we say. Okay, so I'll stop there, and
we have time for questions. It's supposed to say light screen. Is that better? Yes. Okay, so time for questions, not speeches, questions. And I will pass the mic, as you raise your hands.
I agree with your description of events and possibilities. Netanyahu has already said no two-state solution. His election, his term in office is up in what, 3 years?
No, 2026, yeah.
2026, 2 years. He's told the President of the United States, thanks, but no thanks. So, given that situation, and I agree with what Thomas Friedman and you have said as the pragmatism that should be needed that Israel has refused to demonstrate since Netanyahu ordered this huge military operation. How do you get to that point?
So the only way we will get to that point, unfortunately, is through new elections. Now, in a parliamentary system, as opposed to a presidential system, elections don't really happen every 4 years. 4 years is the ceiling. So if you go to Italy, it's like, at least it used to be, like every 7 months you'd have elections. In Israel, I think the average over the life of the state has been 2 years or something like that. Because in a parliamentary system, you can bring the coalition down through a vote of no confidence. And then there are two processes. I don't want to get into the intricacies, but there are two processes. You can just bring it down, or there's something called a constructive vote of no confidence, where a new coalition is sort of cobbled together without new elections. Okay, a new coalition of the existing parties. So that's another, but because even this coalition can't even say the words two states, and I have a feeling like remember the movie Minority Report? Yeah, okay. I think even if they think the thought, two states, somehow it'll collapse. Okay, so there's no way forward in this kind of direction without elections. As I said, we are a nonpartisan group, but we have stated very clearly that leadership has to completely change direction or give up. I mean, this exact same coalition may be reelected. I mean, that's democracy, right? It could be reelected. But the point of small d Democrats is, having gone through what we went through, given this mind-boggling failure that we exhibited, this government, even if you think it's going to be reelected, must go back to the people and get its confidence reaffirmed. Okay, so go back to the public if you think you're going to get reelected, and fine. But you've got to ask for the public's confidence again after what we went through. As individuals and as members in other, Israeli civil society is one of the more amazing global, it's one of the wonders of the world, actually. Has been maybe since forever, but definitely since January 2023, when the judicial reform began. And one of the reasons for my optimism, I have several others, but one of the reasons is that civil society is not going to, first of all, it's regaining its vibrance it's sort of lost on the internal front with October 7th, because it took all its energy and worked for the state, basically. And in many cases, replaced the state. Okay. It now understands that, first of all, the state can do its thing, but the state's going in the wrong direction, and we need to push for major change, including new elections. So.
I had a question about the idea that some outside Arab army or military would rule over Gaza and Israel would stay out. What happens when Hamas starts firing missiles at Israel? How do you see that playing out?
It's hard to go into the details of the scenarios. I mean, the idea would be that there would be a multinational Arab force that would take over Gaza and govern it, at least, you know, in some transitional period. And Israel would be a party to setting up the rules of engagement and what this force would do and how big it would be and so on and so forth, and would have to be satisfied that this is a force that could and would keep Gaza pacified. And there would also be conditions that would relate to situations like that. You know, Israel doesn't govern, but it controls the Gaza now, and missiles get fired. So maybe missiles will get fired in the future as well. One of the conditions would be that Hamas doesn't regain any kind of governance capability. I mean, there are two issues with Hamas. One is the military capability. The other is the civil governance. And one of our, let's say, areas of short-sightedness is because we thought of this as a conventional campaign and not a societal war or campaign, is we weren't paying too much attention to civil activities of Hamas in Gaza as the war continued, because we didn't think that was very important, which of course it is. I mean, will this, let's say it actually happens, will it succeed for sure? I don't know. I can't guarantee that. Will Israeli occupation guarantee that it succeed? I'm not sure. Unless it was really, really, really heavy. I mean, so you have to weigh options. I mean, anything I said is not a good option. That's not a good option to have a multinational Arab force trying to govern Gaza. It's not good. It's much better than the alternatives. For Israel to sit in Gaza now with 2 or 3 divisions for 5 years and have little guerrilla teams knocking off soldiers, and Israel responsible by international law, responsible for the livelihood of 2 million Gazans. And for Israel to start setting up an economic system, an educational system, the whole thing, water, electricity, its responsibility. Reestablish all the medical services and so on. That you can do that. But it's very, very heavy, and it has, as we ripple out, has other ramifications. It is in a scenario where Israel is left alone. It's a scenario in which Israel does not integrate in a regional coalition with U.S. leadership in the more general picture, because that governance of Gaza is part of that picture. So the option in which Israel continues to govern Gaza is also the option in which Israel remains alone to deal with all of its issues. So.
Yes. I have just a simple question for, I know, a very complex situation, but does appeasement work without the eradication of Hamas?
I think, given all the force and degradation that Hamas has suffered, the next step is, and given that it's a very broad social movement with capabilities, I don't think it's not like it's a specific army that you're going to go over and, let's say you could, just destroy it all. I mean, think about it. We've been there for 7 months. And even in the way we understand it, we have destroyed, you hear a different number every day, so it doesn't really matter. I say 12,000 Hamas fighters, okay? 13,000, 15,000. We all believe based on intelligence work and so on, that there are at least, to start with, 35,000. So what exactly do we mean when we say eradicate? So this is not, that in itself is not such a simple proposition. We have degraded at least 80% of the military capabilities and probably 90 or 95% of the missile, of their missile capabilities. There are other things that you would have to do for appeasement to work, such as make sure with the Egyptians that nothing gets over the Egyptian-Gaza border, which has been the problem in terms of supply, I'd say for decades now. So you would have to do that. But I think the main mechanism for dealing with Hamas is to suck out its source of oxygen. Okay, its oxygen is the belief and the desire for a one-state solution, okay, which entails the destruction, the destruction of Israel and everything else you can imagine that goes along with that. It is a one-state, Islamic, Hamas-led solution. That's what they want. Now, within Palestinian society and polity, there are clearly groups and parties that want a two-state solution. And that's where Fatah has been since the mid-90s. And at the moment, Hamas is very popular. And why are they popular? Because they are the only game in town. So if I'm a Palestinian looking at my life and where it might go, I see the Palestinian Authority that has been sort of undercut, undermined, etc., for many, many years by the Israelis. And that's been part of Netanyahu's strategy for a long time. And if I were a Chinese communist, I would describe them as the running dogs of the Israelis, because they basically look out for Israeli security, but there's no future vision of anything, right? If you're a Palestinian, there's nothing in the future. The only group that is willing to provide some image or vision of a future and work for it and kill and die for it is Hamas. Okay, so at the moment, so you have to change that picture. That picture just keeps feeding oxygen to Hamas, and the only way to suck out that oxygen is to go the Biden path, which is, yes, let's create some kind of a future in which every Palestinian can see. Now, not all Palestinians will agree with it, right? Like not all Israelis agree with any policy, but most Palestinians will be able to see a different future that includes recognition and realization of national aspirations for them. So you need a combination of lots of force. I'm not an anti-force advocate. I'm not a pacifist. But so you need a combination of significant force, deterrent force. We lost much of our deterrence on October 7th. That's part of the problem. But you need that. But you also need to. There has to be some way out of the maze. If you're a Palestinian society at the moment, there's no way out. You look around. Nobody's offering us anything, and we can't go in any direction. And our leadership is weak and corrupt and can't deliver anything except improve Israeli security, which is what the PA does. So that picture has to be changed.
I have a question. We've heard that their names are escaping me, but that 2 defense ministers are threatening to quit by June 4th if certain conditions aren't met. A, what is the likelihood of that happening? And B, what would happen if they did?
Yeah, 2 senior ministers, one has actually threatened through an ultimatum to leave the government under certain conditions. I'll say what they are in a minute. And the defense minister has not threatened to leave, but he has made it publicly clear that the direction and the way of moving forward of Netanyahu is not acceptable. And he's like the most senior minister. The first minister, Gantz, his name is Gantz, and he has a party that's outside of the coalition, but he joined when the war began. And his demand is that Israel stop acting without a strategy. And by the way, not a specific strategy. It's not that he's saying, if you don't do A, I'm leaving. He says, we've been at war for 7 months, and we've been jumping up and down and screaming that you can't fight a war without a strategy of where you're trying to go, right? It's a Cheshire Cat problem. If you don't tell me where you want to go, I can't tell you how to get there. I mean, it's one of those situations, but this is not a game, and this is not Alice in Wonderland. This is people dying, right? This is people's lives, on both sides, by the way, pursuing something that nobody can quite define. So, and therefore cannot pursue it well, and doesn't know how far to pursue it. So his point is, and his demand, and he put down an ultimatum, which is we either finally sit down, decide where it is we want to go, where we really want to go, not eradicate Hamas and return the hostages and so on. That's fine. Where do we see ourselves? And he says, if by June 8th we don't put such a plan together, I'm leaving the government. The Minister of Defense has basically gone further and said, if we don't have it's related, of course, but if we don't define strategically, how Gaza, at least Gaza, will be governed from now out, we're in a kind of a no-win situation, because I don't know what we're working towards on that. And I being Gallant, believe that it should be governed by Arabs and not by Jews, and it should be and governance should include the Palestinian Authority, which is a big thing for somebody who's so right-wing to say. Okay. And basically, Prime Minister has responded. Now, if Gantz leaves, nothing will happen unless he leaves and picks up the flag of the revolution. I mean, and he has a big following. So just leaving won't do anything.
We have a lot of people who'd like to ask questions. Do you have time to stay and talk to people?
I have as much time.
Okay, one more question, mic'd, and then the rest of you can just come up afterwards and ask.
In the early days after October 7th, before the policy or even the military reaction took place, what was going on within the War Council? Did Gantz and Gallant at that time, before Israel committed itself to a firm policy, which is hard to undo 7 months on, were they making these arguments then, and why didn't they get an airing at that point when there was a chance to shape the scene?
Okay, so of course I'm not, and nobody was the fly on the wall at that point. Maybe there was, but won't report. As far as we understand, the emotional state, which, as I said, Hamas understood, was such that a major campaign was going to happen. And they went in I don't think with any particular sort of set of principles in mind. They said this is war, solidarity, decision-making. We're looking at the current makeup of the war cabinet. We don't think, regardless of the decisions, we don't think that that group should be alone making decisions. He came in with 2 ex-chiefs of staff, himself and Eisenkot, and we think we can greatly improve decision-making. So to be fair, I mean, in that sense, I don't think they came in and from day one said, well, let's have an exit strategy. I don't think so. And I don't think they were making these arguments in day one. I also don't think anybody was expecting it to go this way. Okay. I don't think that happened. You're about to shut us off, so I do just want to say one thing. Because I said at the beginning, and the title of the talk, this all sounds very grim, and it is. But I am actually very hopeful. Oh. That's fine. You know, the night that Rabin was assassinated, we were at Rabin Square, which was not Rabin Square at the time. And minutes before he was assassinated, he led 400,000 people in a song, which is in itself, anybody heard Rabin's voice to think of him leading a song is, but anyway, and it's the song to peace. But the most important line in the song is not because it's about peace. The most important line in the song is, don't say that a day will come. Go out there and bring the day. So I'm hopeful in the sense that we can make the changes happen, not by sitting on a chair and watching history go by and say, oh, I like that one. Take it off the sushi thing. So I'm hopeful that we can motivate the changes that need to be motivated. And why am I hopeful? I talked about civil society in Israel. The amount of energy and the amount of energy that is now, it's like a flywheel. You have to get it moving. But once you get it moving, it has tremendous momentum. Civil society is getting its act together very fast now and very large. And we know it makes a big difference. Well, of course, it's the Jewish state. So you have, instead of having 10 organizations, you have 200. But because each one is the shul I wouldn't belong to, right? So, but you have tremendous energy, lots of young leadership, people who didn't even think about these issues before. Their biggest problem in life was, these are really good people, but their biggest problem in life is, this year, do we ski in Austria or Switzerland? Those were the big questions. We now find them in the streets, leading organizations, leading movements, people who left their businesses and dedicate their life to doing this. And I see a lot in there. I see that the courts are not afraid, which is really important because they've been under attack for a long time now. The courts are not afraid, which is very significant in this particular battle. For example, the courts a month ago, I think it was a month ago, issued a decision that the state is forbidden, may not transfer funds to yeshivas whose students do not go to the army. So as of then, if it's a yeshiva, and there are different types. So from the national religious groups, they do go to the army and they receive the funding. But the ultra-Orthodox who don't go to the army are no longer funded. So at the moment, nobody feels it because it's only a month in. But this kind of decision by the courts will make a big difference, and it'll be made. So, as I said, the courts are not deterred, which is another reason. Public attitudes, I mean, you'd be surprised. You know, the social psychologists tell us that most of us think we're in a minority when we're not. We think very few people think like us. In general, people are like that. We've been following, and we work with a group, a very, very professional group of social psychologists who have taken the science, tried to apply it for social change. And we've been working with them for, I'd say about a year, but since the war began on issues that have to do with the war, looking very, very closely at where the public is. Not to follow the public, but that gives you an idea of where you can take things. So that's the way we try to work. And when they, you know, they're experts at polling and they have panels and the whole thing, that they're professionals, I'm not. When they ask people, what do you think of a Palestinian state? The response is very negative. Okay? And you'd expect that. Much more negative than it was in the past, because we also go through the normal psychological processes of simplifying. When you go into a conflict, you simplify things. You say, there's them, there's us. They are all bad, we are all good. And not only that, but they are all the same. Not only are they all the same, they're all like Hamas. Okay, so that's something that happens to us. We can't quite control it. When you ask the public, what do you think? And in the interest of time, I won't go into all the details. What do you think of the Biden plan? Okay, not using that word because that's Biden is the charged word. Okay, but so you don't use the word the Biden plan, but you say, what do you think of Israel within a regional coalition that includes the Arab states, American leadership, this big picture, and within this big picture, there's separation from the Palestinians and ultimately a Palestinian state as part of this big picture. And you get 55% in support. So that's not 80%, but there's a lot to work with. If you can get 55% at this point to feel positively about that proposition, and maybe one of the most significant facts is that not a single Israeli leader has tried to lead in that direction. I mean, even opposition leader. So this is people being smarter than their politicians, which I guess is not so outrageous, but this is people being smarter than their leaders. But if a significant leader were to, with a following, were to put that as the direction, it would go from 55 to 75 or to 70 or to something like that. So anyway, those are reasons. You asked why I'm hopeful.
Thank you so much.